Frank Rodriguez sat quietly in his usual corner booth at Mel's Diner, nursing his black coffee and reading the morning paper. At 81, the Korean War veteran moved with the careful precision of a man whose body had served him well for 8 decades. His gray hair was neatly combed, his flannel shirt pressed, and despite his modest pension, he maintained the dignity that had carried him through 3 years of combat and 50 years of honest work. The Tuesday morning ritual had been the same for 5 years since his wife Rosa passed away. Coffee, wheat toast, and the local paper while watching the town wake up through the diner's large windows. Frank knew most of the other regulars by name, and they knew him as the quiet, polite man who always left a generous tip despite clearly counting his dollars carefully. The bell above the door chimed as 3 young men entered, their loud voices and swagger immediately changing the atmosphere of the peaceful diner. They appeared to be in their 20s, wearing expensive sneakers and gold chains, radiating the kind of arrogant energy that suggested they were used to getting their way through intimidation. Lisa Martinez, the young waitress who had always been especially kind to Frank, approached their table with menus and coffee. "Good morning, what can I get started for you?" "Hey, sweetheart," the leader of the group said with a leering grin. "Why don't you come back when you've got more time to chat? We like personal service." Lisa maintained her professional composure despite the uncomfortable attention. "I'll be happy to take your order whenever you're ready." As she walked away, one of the men made a crude comment about her appearance that carried clearly across the diner. Frank looked up from his newspaper, his weathered hands tightening slightly around his coffee cup. The situation escalated when Lisa returned to take their order. When she politely declined one man's request for her phone number, he became increasingly aggressive. "Listen here, little girl," he said, standing up and moving closer to Lisa. "I'm not used to being told no. Maybe you need to reconsider your attitude." Frank quietly folded his newspaper and stood up, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had once led soldiers in combat. "Son," the lady said no. "I suggest you respect that and sit back down." The young man turned toward Frank with disbelief and growing anger. "Old man, this isn't your business. Why don't you go back to your coffee before you get hurt?" "Making sure young women are treated with respect is everyone's business," Frank replied calmly. "You're being inappropriate, and you need to stop." The confrontation might have ended there, but the young man's pride had been challenged in front of his friends. In a moment of rage and poor judgment, he stepped toward Frank and struck the elderly veteran across the face, sending him stumbling backward against his booth. The diner fell completely silent. Lisa gasped and rushed to Frank's side, while other customers sat frozen in shock. Frank touched his split lip, looking at the blood on his fingers with the sad resignation of a man who had seen too much violence in his lifetime. "You shouldn't have done that, son," Frank said quietly. At that moment, the diner's door burst open, and the sound of motorcycle engines filled the air outside. A tall, bearded man in his 40s strode in, wearing a leather vest with patches that identified him as a member of a motorcycle club. Behind him came 5 other bikers, their presence immediately commanding attention. The leader of the bikers scanned the scene and quickly understood what had happened. His eyes moved from Frank's bleeding lip to the 3 young men who suddenly looked much less confident than they had moments before. "Dad," the biker said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "What happened here?" Frank looked up at his son Michael with a mixture of pride and concern. "It's all right, Mike, just a misunderstanding." But Michael Rodriguez had inherited more than his father's sense of justice. He had also inherited the old soldier's ability to assess a situation quickly and respond appropriately. The other customers in the diner watched as this imposing man knelt beside his elderly father with infinite gentleness. "Dad, who hit you?" Frank tried to downplay the situation. "Mike, it's not worth the trouble." "Let's just let it go." But Michael's fellow riders had positioned themselves strategically around the diner, and their message was clear without being explicitly threatening. The young man who had struck Frank was now faced with the reality that actions have consequences. "Sir," Michael said, standing and addressing the young man with deadly calm, "you just made the biggest mistake of your life. That man you hit is a Korean War veteran who earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. He's spent his whole life serving others and treating people with respect. The young man's bravado had completely evaporated. Look, man, I didn't know he was your father. It was just a misunderstanding. You didn't need to know he was my father, Michael replied, his voice growing harder. You just needed to know he was a human being who deserved respect. And the fact that you think hitting someone's father is only wrong if you might get caught shows exactly what kind of person you are. One of Michael's riding companions, a grizzled man in his 50s with arms covered in military tattoos, stepped forward. That old soldier has more honor in his little finger than you 3 have in your entire bodies. Frank struggled to his feet, placing a restraining hand on his son's arm. Michael, I appreciate you being here, but I don't want any more violence. These boys are young and stupid, but they're not worth you getting in trouble. Michael looked at his father, seeing the wisdom and compassion that had shaped his own character despite his rough exterior. You're right, Dad. They're not worth it. But he turned back to the 3 young men, his voice carrying absolute authority. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to my father, and you're going to apologize to the waitress for your inappropriate behavior. Then you're going to pay for everyone's meal in this diner, and you're going to leave. And if I ever hear about you bothering anyone in this town again, we'll have another conversation. The young man who had struck Frank looked around at the bikers, then at the other customers who were watching with obvious disapproval of his actions. I'm sorry, he mumbled toward Frank. I'm sorry I hit you. And, Michael prompted, and I'm sorry for the way we talked to the waitress. Frank nodded with the grace of a man who understood that forgiveness was often more powerful than revenge. Apology accepted, son. But I hope you've learned something here today about treating people with respect. After the 3 young men paid their bill and left, the diner gradually returned to normal. Michael and his riding companions took seats around Frank's booth, their intimidating appearance contrasting sharply with their gentle treatment of the elderly veteran. Lisa brought fresh coffee for everyone, her hands still shaking slightly from the encounter. Mr. Frank, are you sure you're okay? I'm fine, sweetheart, Frank assured her. Though I think I might need some ice for this lip. As Lisa hurried to get ice, Michael studied his father's face with concern. Dad, you could have been seriously hurt. Why didn't you just stay out of it? Frank looked at his son with eyes that held decades of hard-earned wisdom. Mike, when I was your age, I fought in Korea because I believed some things were worth fighting for. I'm 81 now, and I still believe that. A young woman being harassed, people being treated without respect, bullies thinking they can intimidate others. These are still things worth standing up for. One of Michael's riding companions, a man called Bear, shook his head in admiration. Frank, you've got more guts than men half your age. It's not about guts, Frank replied. It's about doing what's right even when it's not easy. That's something my generation learned, and I hope it's something I passed on to my son. Michael felt a deep swell of pride as he looked at his father. Despite their different lifestyles, Frank's quiet dignity and Michael's rough biker persona, they shared the same fundamental values about protecting others and standing up for what was right. Dad, Michael said quietly, you did pass it on. Everything I know about being a man, I learned from watching you. As the morning crowd gradually dispersed and the bikers prepared to leave, Frank reflected on how quickly a routine Tuesday had become a reminder of what mattered most. Family loyalty, mutual respect, and the courage to stand up for others were values that transcended age, appearance, or lifestyle. Lisa approached with the check, but Michael waved it away. Dad's meals are on us from now on, and Lisa, if anyone ever bothers you again, you call me. Frank Rodriguez raised me to believe that good people look out for each other. Frank watched his son and his friends file out of the diner, their motorcycles roaring to life in the parking lot. Despite their intimidating appearance, they had shown exactly the kind of character and loyalty that Frank had tried to instill in Michael decades ago. Sometimes, Frank thought, respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through a lifetime of treating others with dignity, standing up for what's right, and raising children who understand that true strength comes from protecting those who need protection, not from bullying those who are vulnerable.